On the morning of September 19, 1944, First Lieutenant Paul Boche of the 121st Infantry Regiment, 8th Infantry Division, led his platoon into a forest that would consume 3 full American divisions and earn the distinction of being the longest single battle the United States Army has ever fought. The Hürtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile tract of dense woods along the German-Belgian border, was supposed to be a minor obstacle on the road to the Rhine. It would instead become what veterans on both sides would call the Green Hell and the Death Factory. Boche, a Texas native who had already earned a Silver Star at Utah Beach on D-Day, stood at the forest's edge that morning and later wrote in his memoir that he had a feeling of dread I couldn't explain. The trees, mostly fir and spruce, planted in neat rows by German foresters decades earlier, rose 75 to 100 feet high. Their interlocking canopy was so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Visibility was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Artillery spotting was nearly impossible. Air support was useless. Radio signals bounced off the tree trunks and became intelligible. It was terrain that negated every advantage the Americans possessed and amplified every advantage the Germans had retained.
The decision to attack through the Hürtgen had been made at 1st Army Headquarters by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, a cautious and methodical officer who had replaced the flamboyant Omar Bradley when Bradley moved up to command 12th Army Group. Hodges studied his maps and saw that the forest protected the right flank of his advance toward the Ruhr River dams. German forces, if left unmolested in the Hürtgen, could launch flanking attacks against American columns moving toward Cologne and the industrial Ruhr Valley. The logical solution, Hodges believed, was to clear the forest, secure the flank, and continue the advance. What Hodges and his staff failed to appreciate, what could not be appreciated by studying maps in a headquarters miles from the front, was that the Hürtgen Forest was not merely terrain, it was a fortress. The Germans, recognizing the defensive value of the woods, had spent months fortifying it. The Weistwall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, ran directly through the forest. Concrete pillboxes, dragon's teeth tank obstacles, and interconnected bunker systems had been built throughout the area. Every logging trail had been registered for artillery fire. Every fire break had been covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Minefields, anti-personnel and anti-tank had been laid with German foreigners. The forest floor itself, covered with decades of pine needles and fallen branches, was a maze that disoriented even experienced infantrymen within minutes of entering it. Defending this forest was the German 275th Infantry Division, commanded by Generalleutnant Hans Schmidt. The 275th was not an elite formation. It had been rebuilt after being shattered on the Eastern Front, but it contained a core of veterans who understood defensive warfare with an expertise the Americans would learn to respect and fear. Schmidt, a career officer who had fought in World War I and earned the Iron Cross in Russia, had been given clear orders: hold the Hürtgen at all costs. The forest, his superiors told him, protected the approaches to the Ruhr dams. If those dams fell into American hands intact, the Americans could cross the Ruhr in force. But if the Germans retained control of the dams, they could open the floodgates at will and inundate the entire Ruhr Valley, trapping any American forces on the eastern bank.
Schmidt's defensive plan was simple and brutally effective. He would not try to hold a continuous front line That was impossible in such dense terrain. Instead, he positioned strongpoints at key road junctions and in the small villages scattered through the forest. These strongpoints would be mutually supporting, each one within artillery range of the others. Between the strongpoints, he stationed small teams of infantry with orders to harass, delay, and call in artillery on any American advance. The Americans would have to fight for every meter, and they would do it in terrain where their advantages in armor, air power, and artillery observation were nearly worthless. The 9th Infantry Division attacked first, on September 14th, 5 days before Borch's 8th Division entered the battle. The 9th, a veteran formation that had fought across North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, was considered one of the best in the European theater. Its commander, Major General Louis Craig, assured Corps headquarters that his division would clear the forest in a matter of days. The 60th Infantry Regiment led the assault, advancing into the forest near the village of Lammersdorf. What happened next would be repeated, with variations, dozens of times over the next 3 months. The American infantry, advancing in standard tactical formations, entered the forest and immediately lost cohesion. Squads became separated from platoons. Platoons lost contact with company headquarters. The forest, with its poor visibility, dense undergrowth, and disorienting uniformity, turned every unit into a collection of small groups feeling their way forward blindly. Radio communications deteriorated to the point of uselessness. Company commanders had no idea where their forward elements were. Battalion commanders received situation reports that were hours old by the time they arrived. Then the German artillery began to fall. The Germans had registered every trail, every firebreak, every clearing in the forest. When American infantry was spotted, and the Germans had observers hidden throughout the woods, artillery fire missions were called in with devastating accuracy. But it was not the direct hits that caused the most casualties, it was the tree bursts. German artillery shells, fitted with time fuses, were designed to explode in the treetops. When they detonated 50 or 75 feet above the ground, they sent showers of metal fragments and wooden splinters down on the soldiers below. Foxholes, which provided protection from ground-burst shells, were useless against tree bursts. Men died or were horribly wounded while crouched in positions that should have kept them safe. Private First Class George Morgan, a rifleman in the 60th Infantry, later described the experience in an oral history interview. "You couldn't see where the shells were coming from. You couldn't see where anything was coming from. The trees were so thick you couldn't see the sky half the time. But you could hear the shells coming in, that freight train sound, and then the explosions in the trees, and then the screaming. Always the screaming. Guys calling for medics, guys calling for their mothers. After a while, you stopped being afraid and just got numb. You expected to die, and you just kept moving because that's what you were supposed to do." The 60th Infantry advanced approximately 3,000 yards in the first week, less than 2 miles, and suffered over 300 casualties. The 39th Infantry Regiment, attacking further south, made similar progress at similar cost. General Craig, frustrated by the slow pace and mounting casualties, committed his reserve regiment, the 47th Infantry. It made no difference. The forest swallowed entire battalions and gave back only casualty lists. By early October, the 9th Division had fought itself to exhaustion. Of the 3 infantry regiments, 2 were combat ineffective, having lost over 50% of their riflemen. The survivors were suffering from what would later be called combat fatigue. The 1,000-yard stare, the trembling hands, the inability to sleep or eat. The division was pulled out of the line and sent to the rear to rest and refit. In 3 weeks of fighting, it had advanced approximately 4 miles and had not achieved any of its objectives.
The 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard formation that wore the red keystone patch, was sent in to replace the 9th. The 9th had been roughly handled in the Battle of Schmidt 2 weeks earlier, losing an entire battalion when German counterattacks overran its positions. It was still under strength when it entered the Hürtgen on November 2. The division commander, Major General Norman Dutch Coter, the same officer who had rallied troops on Omaha Beach on D-Day with the words, "Rangers, lead the way," was given a clear mission: attack through the forest, seize the town of Schmidt, and secure the approaches to the Ruhr dams. Coter's plan called for the 112th Infantry Regiment to attack on the left, the 109th in the center, and the 110th on the right. The attack would jump off on November 2. The weather had turned cold and wet, and the first snow was beginning to fall. Soldiers who had been fighting in summer uniforms now faced temperatures near freezing. Foot trench, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, was becoming as serious a problem as combat wounds. Battalion aid stations were treating dozens of cases daily, and many men were losing toes or even entire feet to frostbite. On the German side, Generalleutnant Schmidt had been reinforced. The 275th Division was joined by elements of the 89th Infantry Division and by several battle groups from other formations. More importantly, Schmidt now had armor support. The Germans had discovered that they could use their few remaining tanks and assault guns effectively in the forest if they stuck to the roads and trails. American infantry, lacking adequate anti-tank weapons and with no room to maneuver, found themselves facing German armor in situations where the Americans' numerical superiority meant nothing. The 112th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Peterson, attacked toward the village of Vossenack on November 2. The regiment had already been fighting in the Hürtgen for a week and had lost over 500 men. Peterson's orders were to take Vossenack, cross the Kahl River Gorge, a ravine 300 feet deep with sides so steep that vehicles could only cross on a single trail, and seize Schmidt on the far side. It was an ambitious plan, and Peterson had serious doubts about its feasibility. The Kahl Trail, which his tanks and tank destroyers would have to use to cross the gorge, was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. If the trail were cut by German artillery, his armor would be trapped on the wrong side of the river, and his infantry and Schmidt would be isolated. Peterson's concerns were prescient. The 112th Infantry Regiment took Vossenack on November 3 after a day of vicious house-to-house fighting. The Germans counterattacked that night, and the battle for the village continued for another 48 hours. By November 5, the 112th had lost over 200 more men, but they held Vossenack. The regimental commander then ordered the 2nd Battalion, under Major Hazlett, to cross the Kahl Gorge and take Schmidt. Hazlett's battalion descended into the gorge on the morning of November 6. The Kahl Trail, which engineers had been working to improve, was a morass of mud. Vehicles slipped off the narrow path and became stuck. The battalion's attached tank company, 9 M4 Sherman tanks from the 707th Tank Battalion, struggled to negotiate the steep descent. 2 tanks threw their tracks on the way down. A third slid off the trail and couldn't be recovered. By the time Hazlett's infantry reached the far side of the gorge, they had only 6 tanks in support, and those tanks were low on fuel and ammunition because the supply vehicles hadn't been able to follow them across the trail. Despite these difficulties, the 2nd Battalion pushed on toward Schmidt.
They reached the edge of town on the afternoon of November 6, and after a brief firefight with German outposts, entered Schmidt. By nightfall, the battalion held the town. Hazlitt sent a message back to regimental headquarters. Schmidt secured, casualties moderate, request resupply and reinforcement. The request could not be fulfilled. The Kahl Trail, which was the only route into Schmidt, had been cut by German artillery. The tanks that had made it across were now out of fuel and ammunition. The battalion in Schmidt was isolated, holding a position 3 miles beyond the main American lines, with no armor support and with supply lines that existed only on paper. Generalleutnant Schmidt, monitoring the situation from his headquarters in the rear, recognized the opportunity. The Americans had done exactly what they had hoped they would do. They had pushed deep into the forest, extended their supply lines to the breaking point, and isolated a battalion in exposed terrain. Schmidt ordered the 89th Infantry Division to counterattack. At dawn on November 7, German infantry supported by tanks and assault guns struck the 2nd Battalion in Schmidt from 3 sides.
Major Hazlitt's men fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The few American tanks in the town, unable to maneuver in the narrow streets and out of ammunition for their main guns, used their machine guns until they ran out of belts. German armor methodically destroyed them. By mid-morning, the 2nd Battalion's position had collapsed. Hazlitt ordered his men to withdraw back across the Kahl Gorge, but the withdrawal turned into a rout. German machine guns raked the American soldiers as they fled down the steep slopes. Artillery fire caught groups of men in the open. Many soldiers, disoriented and panicked, never made it back to American lines. Some wandered in the forest for days before being captured or killed. Of the approximately 800 men of the 2nd Battalion who had crossed the Kahl on November 6th, fewer than 200 made it back. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. The attack on Schmidt had been a catastrophic failure, and the 112th Infantry Regiment was now combat ineffective. Colonel Peterson, whose warnings had been ignored, was relieved of command. The regiment was pulled out of the line. But the battle for the Hürtgen was far from over. General Hodges, under pressure from his superiors to maintain offensive momentum, ordered another division into the forest. The 4th Infantry Division, which had landed at Utah Beach on D-Day and had been in continuous combat for 5 months, was given the mission of continuing the attack. The division commander, Major General Raymond Barton, protested that his regiments were under strength and exhausted, but the orders stood. On November 16th, the 4th Division attacked into the Hürtgen. The objective was the same as before: clear the forest, reach the Ruhr River, and secure the dams. The 22nd Infantry Regiment led the assault, attacking toward the villages of Grosshau and Kleinhau. The 12th and 8th Infantry Regiments followed, tasked with clearing the forest on either flank. The fighting was, if anything, worse than what the earlier divisions had experienced. The Germans, having studied American tactics for 2 months, had refined their defensive techniques. They allowed American infantry to advance into kill zones, then hit them with concentrated artillery and mortar fire. Small groups of German infantry, armed with machine guns and the deadly Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, ambushed American patrols. German snipers, tied into trees or hidden in camouflage positions, picked off American officers and NCOs. The loss of junior leaders, lieutenants, captains, sergeants, was particularly devastating because these were the men who held units together in the chaos of forest combat.
Sergeant Frank Madzia, a squad leader in the 22nd Infantry, described the fighting in a letter written weeks later. "You couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet in any direction.
The Germans could be anywhere. They'd let you walk right past them, then shoot you in the back. Or they'd wait until your whole squad was in a clearing, then open up with machine guns from 2 or 3 sides at once. We lost half our company in the first 3 days, and we hadn't even reached our first objective. The worst part was the tree bursts. You'd be in your foxhole, feeling relatively safe, and then you'd hear the shells coming in, and you knew there was nothing you could do. If it burst right over you, you were dead or wounded. If it burst 20 yards away, the guy 20 yards away was dead or wounded. It was just luck, random chance. After a while, you stopped thinking about it. You just did your job and hoped. The 4th Division fought for 3 weeks in the Hürtgen. By December 7, when it was finally pulled out of the line, it had suffered over 5,000 casualties, including 1,200 cases of trench foot and combat fatigue. The division had advanced approximately 7 miles. It had taken the villages it was ordered to take, but the forest was not cleared. The Germans still held the raw dams, and the strategic situation had not changed. On the German side, the cost had also been severe. The 275th Infantry Division had been reinforced twice and had still lost over 3,000 men. The 89th Division was at half strength. Entire companies had been wiped out in American artillery barrages or overrun by attacks that occasionally succeeded through sheer weight of numbers. But the Germans still held the forest, and they had inflicted far more casualties than they had suffered. General Lieutenant Schmidt, in his headquarters, reviewed the casualty reports with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. His divisions had fought magnificently, but they were being ground down. Replacements were not arriving in sufficient numbers. Ammunition was becoming scarce. The Americans could afford to trade casualties at a 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 ratio because they had the manpower and logistics to sustain such losses. The Germans did not. Schmidt knew that eventually, through sheer attrition, the Americans would break through. But every day his men held the forest was another day that the raw dams remained in German hands, and that meant another day that the American advance toward the Rhine was stalled. In early December, the weather turned even worse. Heavy snow fell and temperatures dropped below freezing. The soldiers on both sides suffered equally from the cold. Frostbite cases multiplied. Supply became even more difficult. German and American wounded, lying in the forest waiting for evacuation, died of exposure before they could be reached. The forest, already a nightmare of violence, became a frozen hell. Then, on December 16, the strategic situation changed completely. The Germans launched their massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. American divisions that were scheduled to relieve the exhausted units in the Hürtgen were diverted to meet the German thrust. The attack in the Hürtgen was called off. The 4th Division, the 8th Division, and the remnants of the 28th Division were pulled out and sent south to help contain the German breakthrough. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest officially ended in mid-December, though fighting continued sporadically into February 1945. American forces had suffered approximately 33,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or incapacitated by trench foot and combat fatigue. German casualties were estimated at around 28,000. The Americans had advanced about 10 miles. They had not reached the raw dams, which remained in German hands until February. The strategic objectives for which the battle had been fought were not achieved. In the decades after the war, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest became a subject of controversy among military historians and veterans. Many argued that the battle should never have been fought, that the forest could have been bypassed, or that the objectives were not worth the cost.
Some blamed General Hodges for persisting in a battle that was clearly unwinnable under the conditions that existed. Others pointed to failures in intelligence, in tactics, in logistics, and in command decision-making at multiple levels. Ernest Hemingway, who was in the Hürtgen as a war correspondent in November 1944, later wrote that it was Passchendaele with tree bursts. He was comparing it to one of the most horrific battles of World War I, and veterans on both sides agreed with the assessment. The Hürtgen had much in common with the trench warfare of 1914 to 1918, small gains purchased at enormous cost, attacks that achieved nothing, a grinding attrition that destroyed units without achieving strategic results.
Lieutenant Paul Boche, who survived the Hürtgen and later retired as a colonel, wrote in his memoir, Road to Hürtgen, Forest in Hell, that the battle was a monument to the old army concept that when you give a combat division a mission, you expect them to carry it out regardless of cost. We carried out our missions. The cost was 3 divisions destroyed. Boche, who was a company commander in the 121st Infantry during the battle, described the constant fear, the sense of helplessness against the tree bursts, the steady erosion of unit cohesion as experienced soldiers were killed or wounded, and replaced by green recruits who often didn't survive their first day in the forest. On the German side, veterans were equally haunted by their experience. Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld of the 275th Infantry Division was killed on November 12 while trying to rescue an American soldier who was trapped in a minefield and calling for help. Lengfeld, a medical officer, heard the American's cries and went into the minefield to help him. He stepped on a mine and was killed instantly. After the war, American veterans learned of Lengfeld's sacrifice and erected a memorial to him in the forest. The inscription reads, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." It stands as a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, humanity can survive. Obergefreiter Josef Putz, who fought in the 89th Infantry Division, wrote in a letter preserved in German military archives, "We knew we were going to die in that forest. The Americans had more of everything, more men, more artillery, more supplies. But we also knew that every day we held them was another day that the fatherland had to prepare its defenses. We were not Nazis, most of us. We were just soldiers doing our duty. The Americans were brave. They kept coming, even after they'd been decimated. They would attack the same position 5 or 6 times, losing men each time, until finally they overran it. We respected them for that. And we killed them for that. What else could we do? We had our orders." The tactical lessons of the Hürtgen were studied extensively by the United States Army in the post-war period. The battle highlighted the dangers of fighting in close terrain, where technological advantages are negated. It demonstrated the importance of proper equipment. Soldiers fighting in the Hürtgen lacked cold weather gear, proper boots, and adequate supplies. It showed the limitations of artillery in heavily wooded terrain and the need for alternative forms of fire support. Most importantly, it raised questions about the relationship between strategic objectives and tactical reality, questions that would be asked again in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. For the soldiers who fought there, German and American alike, the Hürtgen Forest remained a place of nightmares. Veterans who returned to the area after the war often broke down when they entered the forest. The neat rows of trees, replanted by German foresters in the 1950s, were haunted by memories of friends who had died there. The small villages, Vossenack, Schmidt, Großhau, had been rebuilt, but veterans could still see them as they had been in 1944, burning ruins, fought over house by house, their streets littered with bodies. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a group of American and German veterans met in the Hürtgen Forest for a memorial ceremony. They were old men now, in their 70s and 80s, but they remembered. They remembered the cold, the fear, the constant presence of death. They remembered their friends who hadn't come home, and they remembered each other, not as enemies, but as soldiers who had shared an experience that only they could truly understand. Colonel Bosch, attending that ceremony, said in his remarks, "We fought each other with everything we had. We killed each other without mercy, because that's what soldiers do in war. But we never hated each other. We were professionals doing a terrible job. They fought well, we fought well. In the end, we lost 33,000 men, they lost 28,000, and all we can say is that we survived and they didn't. There were no winners in the Hürtgen, there were only survivors and the dead." General Major Hans Schmidt, who had commanded the German defense of the forest, did not attend the ceremony. He had died in 1972, having spent the post-war years working quietly as an engineer in Bavaria. But his son was there, and he read from his father's unpublished memoir. "I am proud of what my men accomplished in the Hürtgen. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they held. They did their duty. But I am also haunted by the cost. Every night I see the faces of the young men who died under my command. They trusted me to lead them well, and I sent them into a forest where thousands of them died for an objective that in the end did not matter. Germany lost the war. The Roer dams were eventually captured. All those deaths accomplished was to delay the inevitable by a few weeks. Was it worth it? As a soldier, I say yes. We were following orders and we executed our mission as well as it could be executed. As a man, as a father, I say no. Nothing is worth the loss of so many young lives." The memorial in the Hürtgen Forest today is a place of pilgrimage for veterans and their families. There are markers for the American divisions that fought there, the 1st, 4th, 8th, 9th, and 28th, and for the German divisions as well. There are individual graves, carefully maintained by both American and German veterans organizations. And there is a sense of profound sadness that permeates the place. For the men who fought in the Hürtgen, both German and American, the battle represented something important about the nature of war. It was not a heroic struggle with clear objectives and decisive results. It was a brutal, grinding, meaningless fight that consumed men and units without achieving anything of lasting value. It was, in the words of one veteran, proof that war is not glorious, not romantic, not even rational. It's just organized insanity, and we were the ones who paid the price. The forest itself has recovered. The trees have grown back again. The scars of battle have been covered by decades of new growth. But for those who were there, who lived through the green hell, the Hürtgen will never just be a forest. It will always be a battlefield, a place where thousands of young men, American, German, and others, gave their lives for objectives that history has judged to be not worth the price. Staff Sergeant John Forsell, a forward observer with the 4th Division's artillery, perhaps said it best in an interview decades later. "People ask me what the Hürtgen was like, and I don't know how to answer. How do you describe hell? You can't. You can only live through it and remember. And the thing I remember most is that the Germans were just like us, scared kids far from home, doing what they were told, trying to survive. We killed them, and they killed us, and in the end, nobody won. We just